Today, on Brief History, we take a look at one of the more forgotten kings in French royal history. Growing up under the strict leadership of his father, this man would fail to grasp the essentials of kingship, which would leave him helplessly in over his head when he became king. His youth would be filled with uprisings, civil war, familial drama, and a son limited in his ability to rule. Join me as I take a brief look at Louis II, King of the Franks, remembered today as Louis the Stammerer. Louis was born on November 1st, 846, somewhere within the bounds of the vast Frankish Empire, but the exact location of his birth is unknown. He was the son of Charles, King of the Franks, also known as Charles the Bald, and his mother was a woman named Ermentrude of Orleans. Louis would have as many as 15 siblings and half-siblings throughout his life, but only a few of these siblings require attention: an elder sister named Judith, and 3 younger brothers named Charles, aka Charles the Child, Lothair, aka Lothair the Lame, and Carloman. They will come up briefly throughout Louis's story. There is very little that is known of Louis's early life, and in fact, there is very little that is known of Louis's life in general, but there are some important things that need to be noted about the political atmosphere Louis would be born into before we get into the events of his life that are known. First, it is important to note that Louis was born during a time of great change within Carolingian Francia. The Franks, a once barbaric people in the days of the Roman Empire, took over control of the territory known as Gaul after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Through the brutal rule of the first dynasty of Frankish rulers known as the Merovingians, Gaul slowly began to be consolidated into one territory, largely ruled over by the Franks. The decline of the Merovingian dynasty coincided with the ascendancy of the so-called Carolingians, the next dynasty of Franks to rule Francia, and the dynasty to which Louis himself would belong. Louis's great-grandfather, the famous Charlemagne, oversaw the Carolingian Empire at its peak, being instrumental in conquering neighboring territories so that the kingdom of the Franks encompassed all of what we know today to be Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. He had been crowned as emperor in the year 800, which brought forth a renewal of the Roman Empire in the West under the rule of the Franks. Unfortunately, after the death of Louis's powerful great-grandfather, Carolingian Francia began a decline that it would never recover from. Louis's grandfather, Louis I, known as Louis the Pious, warred with his sons, Louis's uncles, and Louis's father, Charles, a younger half-brother to these troublesome uncles, found it difficult to carve out any inheritance amidst these disputes. Luckily for Louis, his father Charles the Bald did in fact inherit territory in Francia after the death and fall from grace of some of the troublesome uncles mentioned previously. Nonetheless, the atmosphere that Louis would be born into would be one of division and conflict. Louis's father Charles the Bald had been forced to fight for his right to rule the territory that had been designated to him by his own father. He and his 2 remaining half-brothers, named Lothair and Louis the German, again these men were Louis's uncles, were constantly undermining each other and attempting to take control of each other's territory. Although at times it appeared as if Louis's father would lose everything, he in fact defended his territory admirably and was able to consolidate his position in the West. An agreement was finally reached between Louis's father and Louis's uncles, known as the Treaty of Verdun, where Charlemagne's empire was divided 3 ways. Louis's uncle, Louis the German, inherited the eastern half of the empire, known today as East Francia, which included mostly Germanic lands. Louis's uncle Lothair I inherited the middle part of Francia, known today as Middle Francia, which included Italy. And Louis's father Charles the Bald inherited the western part of Francia, known today as West Francia, which included what we would know today to be France. However, this division only settled matters for Louis's father externally. Internally, he still faced serious issues. Louis's father was unfortunately forced to deal with almost constant rebellion and threats from disgruntled magnates, familial claimants, Viking raiders, and his own children, which would include Louis himself, as we will see. Furthermore, the kingdom of West Francia that Louis's father controlled could be, and was, further divided into historical regions of influence, which included Neustria in the north, a center of Frankish power since the days of the Merovingian kings of the Franks, Burgundy to the south, and Aquitaine to the southwest. Louis's father's kingdom would eventually include Provence to the southeast and Italy as well, but we will touch on the acquisition of these territories momentarily. For now, it is important to note a common practice that had been utilized by the Frankish Carolingian kings. This practice involved these kings installing their young sons, or princes if you will, over sub-regions within the Frankish Empire as sub-kings, in essence puppet kings, to assist with the maintenance of the realm. This had begun during the reign of Louis's great-grandfather Charlemagne and had been continued by his grandfather Louis I. In fact, Louis's own father Charles the Bald and grandfather Louis I had been designated as rulers over Aquitaine in their youths, and this practice would continue with Louis, as we will see. By the time Louis was born in 846, his father was in the process of consolidating his position as king of West Francia. Louis would be called upon by his father to act as a figurehead for him within his kingdom. He would fail to live up to his father's expectations. Louis's father, during the early years of his reign after the Treaty of Verdun, which had divided the empire between him and his half-brothers, was forced to deal with many problems internally. He had been installed as ruler over Aquitaine after the death of his half-brother, Louis's uncle, a man named Pepin I of Aquitaine. But Pepin I had, by the time of his death, produced sons, including a man that is known today as Pepin II of Aquitaine. The territory of Aquitaine had always held a degree of separation from their Frankish rulers to the north, despite being subjects to them, and had always maintained a separate identity to the southwest. This territory had historically been a difficult territory to rule over for the Frankish kings, which is why Charlemagne had made the decision to install his son Louis the Pious as sub-king decades prior, and why Louis the Pious had done the same thing with his sons as well. Many of the Aquitanian nobles resisted Louis's father being made king over them, and instead looked to Pepin II, Louis's first cousin, who they saw as one of their own. Pepin II would be a major source of discontent for Louis's father, and indeed, Charles's choice to install a sub-king over Aquitaine was due in part to his need to offset the influence of Pepin II. Pepin, however, would not be the only person that would cause Louis's father problems. The area in the northwest of West Francia, near the borders of Brittany, was an area of serious discontent as well. This area, which constitutes a region we would commonly know today as Maine and/or Anjou, was another region that Louis's father had serious issues with. This was due to a couple reasons. First, Viking raids were a serious threat in this region, and during the reign of Louis's father, Viking raids had begun to become more and more prevalent. Second, Brittany had not yet been subdued and existed as a separate and potentially dangerous opponent outside of Frankish control to the northwest. Lastly, the magnates installed there, which would eventually come to include a man named Robert the Strong, had rebellious tendencies and would often find ways to rise up against Louis's father if they thought they had been slighted in any way. It is in these two quarrelsome regions, northwestern Neustria and Aquitaine, that Louis would begin to play a role in his father's kingdom. In 856, Louis was invested as ruler of Neustria, which included the contentious regions in the northwest discussed previously. His father had made peace with the Duke of Brittany at the time, a man named Arispo, and had decided to betroth the 10-year-old Louis to Arispo's daughter. It was hoped by Louis's father that this would allow he and Arispo to control this contentious region as allies and co-fathers of their children. Louis was appointed an experienced royal notary named Joseph to tutor him, and it was implied that Louis would have a chancery and would issue summons under the guide of his father and father-in-law. For all intents and purposes, it appeared that Louis would be set up as a sub-king in a way that his father and grandfather had been before him. However, this was not to be. Robert the Strong, along with other Neustrian magnates, were threatened by this move and thus chose to rebel against Charles the Bald and his son Louis. Robert the Strong was an interesting character in that, at this time, he was simply a regional magnate who had risen to prominence under Louis's father. However, both of his sons would become kings of France in their own right, and it would be through him that the vast majority of French kings would descend from. Nonetheless, in 856, Robert the Strong had become a rebel and had taken steps to rise up against Louis and his father by inviting Louis's uncle, Louis the German, to invade from his eastern kingdom of East Francia. Furthermore, Arispo of Brittany, the man who was set to become Louis's father-in-law, was assassinated by his cousin, a man named Solomon, who took over his role as duke. Solomon was hostile to Louis and his father and allied with Robert the Strong against them. Louis, along with his followers, were driven out of Neustria to the east, thus leaving Charles the Bald's plans for this region in disarray. Louis's uncle Louis the German did in fact invade from the east, forcing Charles the Bald to retreat to Burgundy. Luckily for Louis, his father was a capable and undeterred king and had the support from the bishops of the church. He was able to garner enough support in Burgundy to push Louis the German back into his eastern kingdom, thus re-establishing control over his kingdom by 859. By the following year in 860, Louis was given the lay abbacy of Saint-Martin-Tours, which meant that the sub-kingdom plans for him in Neustria were now back on. Robert the Strong had been forced to make peace with Louis's father and accept that he and Louis would in fact be ruling in Neustria together. Robert was forced in part to come to terms with Louis's father because Louis's father had by this time installed his second son, Charles, Louis's younger brother, as king in Aquitaine, thus eliminating some of the allies that Robert could rely on in that region. It is here in the 860s that things began to change for Louis, and not for the better. This was due to the fact that the children of Charles the Bald, including Louis, began to show their unreliability, and this started with Louis's elder sister, Judith. Judith had been married to an Anglo-Saxon king of England named Ethelwulf, but had been widowed in 858. She had then decided that she wished to marry a man named Baldwin I, Margrave of Flanders, but knew that her father Charles the Bald would not approve. Thus, she turned to her younger brother Louis, seeking his approval of the marriage instead of her father's. Louis approved of this marriage, but Judith was still forced to elope with Baldwin, which was something that unsurprisingly angered Louis's father greatly. Louis was soon to follow in his sister's footsteps, as was his younger brother and sub-king of Aquitaine, Charles, known as Charles the Child. Both married without their father's consent in 862, with Louis taking a woman named Ansgard of Burgundy as his first wife. The pair would produce 2 children in the coming years, Louis, known today as Louis III, and Carloman, known today as Carloman II. Marrying without his father's consent was bad enough for the young prince, but Louis went further in 862 by deciding to mount a full-blown rebellion against his father. By this time, around 16 years of age, Louis was upset by his father's unwillingness to allow him or his brother in Aquitaine any form of control or power in the region or regions that they had control over. He, with the help of the Bretons, attacked his old rival, Robert the Strong, and ravaged the Angevin countryside before his support collapsed due to a counterattack by Robert the Strong. Louis was once again removed from his Neustrian subkingdom, this time by his father as punishment, and had his lay abbacy of Saint-Martin removed from his benefices. His father, angered and disgusted by Louis's actions, granted him instead the county of Meaux, an area which had been ravaged by Vikings as a result of the uprising. Although Louis would be sent back to Neustria in 865, it was only for a short time, and he was sent with no royal title. Nonetheless, events in the following year of 866 caused Louis's position to change once again. This was the year that his younger brother Charles the Child was accidentally killed after being struck in the head during mock combat. Therefore, Louis's father made the decision to have Louis take over Charles the Child's role as king in Aquitaine, but again, he was to be given no control and was simply used as a puppet in the hands of his powerful father. It should be noted here that although previous kings like Louis's grandfather and great-grandfather, Louis the Pious and Charlemagne, had kept a grip on their sub-king sons, Louis's father, Charles the Bald, took this control to a whole new level. Previous sub-kings, although controlled by their overlord fathers, had had a degree of autonomy and that they had been able to issue coinage and issue instruments of government with the influence of powerful men around them. They were also able to gain more independent control from their king fathers as they aged and learn more about the art of kingship and diplomacy. This was not the case for Louis. His father allowed him nothing in the form of autonomy, preventing him from issuing any type of coinage or instruments of government as he aged. It was clear that Louis was not someone who his father trusted, and this probably was due to a multitude of reasons, some of which have already been touched on. First, Louis was thought to have been a weak child and young man, possibly suffering from a stammer, hence why contemporaries began to call him Louis the Stammerer. But the main reason that Charles distrusted his son was probably due to the fact that he had rebelled against him in 862, an event we already touched on. However, there was most likely other reasons why Charles the Bald refused to invest any energy into his son in the late 860s and early 870s. By 870 and 871, Louis was his father's only remaining legitimate male heir. His younger brother, Charles the Child, we remember, had been accidentally killed in mock combat, while his brothers Lothair the Lame and Carloman had also died or been exiled. Carloman, the youngest of Louis's brothers, had been blinded by his father and exiled after he attempted to leave the church life he had been destined for in order to attempt to carve out a secular appointment in some of his father's newly conquered territory. With the death and exile of these brothers, one would have thought that Louis's stock would have risen significantly, since he was the only remaining son of his king father. But it, in fact, did not, and the reasons for this was probably due to the fact that Charles the Bald most likely did not see Louis actually remaining as his primary heir for long. In 870, Louis's mother, Queen Ermentrude, had died, and Louis's father quickly remarried after her death to a woman named Richildis of Provence. Thus, Charles the Bald most likely expected to produce more children, including more sons, which could supplant Louis in the plan of succession in the future. But luckily for Louis, his father's plans for more children would fall short of expectations, and Louis would in fact remain as his father's heir. By 870, Louis was a young man of 24, but his hands had been tied by his father for almost his entire life. Soon, he would be forced onto the world stage and would need to play an important role in the realm of politics. Would he rise to the occasion, or would he fail to stand up to the test? Louis's position in Aquitaine as sub-king was an unfortunate one, as he twiddled his thumbs while his father refused him the ability to have any type of control. The king had installed a man named Boso, brother of the new Queen Richildis, as Louis's chamberlain, and a tight leash was kept on Louis by his father. Further humiliation was to come Louis's way when in 875, he was compelled to repudiate his wife Ansgard, the mother of his two sons, so that he could marry a woman named Adelaide of Paris, a woman who his father wished him to marry for political purposes. Louis did what his powerful father required of him and saw to his marriage with Ansgard being dissolved in 875, at which point he married Adelaide. Louis and his new wife would produce two children, a daughter named Ermentrude and a son named Charles, although Charles, who would go on to become Charles III or Charles the Simple, would not be born until after Louis's death. Nonetheless, this change in spouses for Louis in 875 would lead to trouble in the future for all of his sons, as their legitimacy would eventually be called into question as a result of it. But 875 was an important year for Louis and his family for other reasons. We remember that after Louis's grandfather Louis the Pious had died, the Carolingian kingdom had been split between his three sons, which had included Louis's father, Charles the Bald, who had inherited West Francia. The eldest of these sons, Lothair I, who ruled over Middle Francia, had died in 855, at which point his kingdom had been split between his three sons, Lothair II, who inherited the north, aka Lotharingia, Louis II, who inherited Italy and the imperial title, and Charles, who inherited a small, newly created kingdom known as Provence. By 875, two of these sons, Lothair II and Charles of Provence, had also died, and thus their territory had been split between Louis's father, Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, and his uncle, Louis the German, king of East Francia. Therefore, Middle Francia, including all of Lotharingia and Provence, had for all intents and purposes been absorbed by the kingdoms to the east and the west of it. The only remaining son of Lothair I, Louis II of Italy, died in 875, which led to a mad dash for his territory in Italy and the imperial title. Louis's father Charles had support of the papacy, led at the time by Pope John VIII, and so he gathered a force and traveled south to secure the Italian throne and imperial title. Louis, for his part, was finally given a chance to prove himself when he was sent to his father's recently acquired eastern territories in Lotharingia formerly part of Middle Francia. Charles the Bald knew that traveling to Italy would leave his northern realm exposed to his brother Louis the German, and thus it was hoped that Louis could prevent his uncle and or cousins in the east from meddling in his father's western realm while he was occupied in Italy. Louis's father was successful in taking control of Italy and in securing the imperial title, being crowned emperor in Rome in December 875. However, as expected, Louis's uncle Louis the German in the east did make moves to counter this. He dispatched his own sons, named Carloman and Charles the Fat, to confront Louis's father in Italy, while he himself traveled west in order to invade Louis's father's western kingdom. Despite Louis's presence in the eastern parts of his father's realms, he was unsuccessful in preventing his uncle from entering West Francia. Once again, he had come up short of his father's expectations. Nonetheless, Louis the German found no support in West Francia, and thus, after ravaging the countryside there for a time, he was forced to return home to his eastern kingdom, where he died the following year in 876. Louis's father hoped to capitalize on Louis the German's death by seizing all of Lotharingia, which had been divided previously, and so advanced eastward in hopes of defeating Louis the German's sons. But he was unfortunately defeated by Louis the German's son, Louis the Younger, at the Battle of Andernach on October 8, 876, thus ending any hope for a reunited Frankish Empire. Interestingly, although Louis was still his father's only heir at the time of this event, his father did almost produce a son that would have probably supplanted him in the line of succession in 876. Charles's second wife, now Empress Richildis, had been pregnant leading up to the Battle of Andernach, but she unfortunately gave birth to a son soon after this event, who sadly passed away within a couple months. Louis would remain as his father's only legitimate heir, and his time was quickly approaching. As part of the agreement reached with the Pope to be crowned emperor, Louis's father had agreed to act as protector of the papacy in Rome, who were being threatened by the Saracens and troublesome nobles in southern Italy. Thus, when Louis's father was called to travel back to Italy to defend Rome against Muslim invaders, he felt obliged to do so. In his absence, Charles was to leave the running of the kingdom to his son Louis, but before leaving, he held an assembly at Chieri and laid down some ground rules to limit his son's abilities while he was away. In this assembly, Charles determined that Louis would not be able to stay at certain palaces and that he would not have the ability to grant benefices, aka lands and offices, to anyone if an incumbent of one of these benefices died. Instead, the benefice or office holder's son would simply inherit their father's title until Charles had time to handle the issue on his own. Thus, it was clear that even in leaving the management of the realm under his son, Louis's father did not trust him. Little did anyone know, this would be the last time that Charles the Bald went on campaign. During his trip to Italy to support the Pope, he traveled on ahead of some of his magnates, who agreed to catch up with him later. He was soon after confronted by his nephew Carloman, son of Louis the German in the east, who had traveled south to Italy to stop him. This caused Charles the Bald to halt his advance and wait for his expected reinforcements to come from his rear. However, these reinforcements never came, as the magnates who had lagged behind chose to abandon the emperor at this time. Why exactly they did this is not known with certainty, but there are some possibilities that have been put forward. The campaign was certainly unpopular, and Viking raids had caused many in Francia to see the Italian campaign as an unnecessary risk, as it was clear that there were certain problems in Francia that needed to be dealt with before help was extended to the Pope. Some also believed that the Frankish nobility were uneasy about Louis being in charge of the realm in his father's absence due to his unpreparedness and lack of political skill. Others believed still that the nobility feared for Charles' life, as many a Carolingian king had met his end while traveling south in Italy. What would happen if Charles died in Italy and the succession of Louis was forced to take place sooner than expected? In this, the nobles were soon to find out. With the failure of the Frankish nobility to support him, Louis's father was forced to turn around and head back to Francia. En route, he fell violently ill to the point that he knew that he would not survive. After entrusting his royal regalia to his wife Richildis with instructions to deliver it to Louis, Louis's father, Charles the Bald, died in October 877 at 54 years of age. 31-year-old Louis was now the king of West Francia and helplessly in over his head. Louis learned of his father's death at Orville near Laon, and he immediately attempted to distribute honors and privileges to the first men that presented themselves to him, which not only went directly against the orders that his father had left for him before his departure to Italy, but also was to the detriment of those returning from the Italian campaign. This, of course, caused serious discontent. Louis's stepmother, Empress Richildis, and her brother Boso, who had been an important magnate in Louis's household during his time as King of Aquitaine, did not submit to Louis immediately, and in fact, they refused to hand over to Louis his father's royal regalia in opposition. Francia was soon teetering on the brink of civil war as Richildis and Boso ravaged the countryside as a result of Louis's failure to uphold the promises he had made at the Assembly of Chieri prior to his father's departure to Italy. Luckily, Hinchmar, the Bishop of Reims, mediated wisely between Louis and the disgruntled magnates and was able to reconcile them to each other after pressing Louis to respect the rights of his vassals. Louis was very lucky to have a man like Hinchmar advising him, as he was a stable and experienced mind to guide an unprepared new king. Hinchmar crowned Louis as the king of the West Franks at Compiègne in 877, with the abbots, bishops, and lay nobility pledging their fealty to him in the process. However, Louis would unsurprisingly turn out to not be the king that his father had been. Attention soon turned to Rome, where Pope John VIII was devastated by the news of Charles the Bald's death. Pope John had placed all his faith in Charles the Bald, defending the papacy against the foreign and domestic threats that he was facing. These threats were becoming ever more worrisome as the months progressed, and so John crossed the Alps in order to convene a council where it was hoped that all of the Carolingian princes would meet and set a course of common action. This council was held at Troyes in 878, although Pope John was disappointed that the only Carolingian ruler to show up to this council was Louis himself. Louis's German cousins to the east, sons of Louis the German, were either too sick or too busy to come. Thus, after shoring up a few things religiously, Pope John VIII recrowned Louis a second time and enticed him with the promise of an imperial title if he would simply travel to Rome for a coronation. This was not to be. By this time, Louis had been dealing with a rebellion led by a man named Bernard of Gotia, who had been losing influence in the region of the Spanish March under the reign of Louis's father. Thus, he refused the Pope's offers, which forced Pope John to return to Italy with Boso, who he tried unsuccessfully to make king of Italy and emperor himself. Louis, for his part, on the advice of Hinchmar of Reims, decided to meet and take steps to solidify a positive relationship with his eastern cousins, sons of his uncle Louis the German. He met with Louis the Younger at Fouron in 878, where the cousins reaffirmed the division of Lotharingia that had taken place under their fathers. They furthermore agreed to meet once again in the near future, this time with Louis the Younger's brothers, Charles the Fat and Carloman, in order to come to a full agreement with all the remaining Carolingian kings of the Franks. They, more importantly, agreed to help each other against the raids of the Northmen who had continued to ravage the Frankish coasts, and to recognize the rights of their sons to their respective successions. After coming to agreement with his cousin, Louis turned back to his western kingdom with plans to move against the rebel Bernard of Gotia in the southwest. He would, unfortunately, never get the chance to do this. In the spring of the following year, Louis fell ill, and after designating his eldest son, Louis, as his sole successor, died on April 10, 879. He was 32 years old and had ruled for less than 2 years. He was buried at the Abbey of Saint Corneille in Compiègne, where he died, but this abbey over the centuries was looted multiple times and destroyed. With this abbey's destruction, Louis's remains have unfortunately been lost to history. However, some of the abbey's ruins have been incorporated into a library at Compiègne, which can still be visited to this day. The short life and reign of Louis the Stammerer is, unfortunately, a difficult reign to reflect upon. Louis, being a sickly and stammering individual, had very little chance of success from the beginning of his life. It was only through the deaths of his brothers and his father's inability to produce any additional heirs that Louis inherited the West Frankish crown. His experiences throughout his life, or lack thereof, were certainly indicators as to what he would be like as a king, as the limitations that were placed on him by his father hindered his ability to learn important kingly lessons in his youth. The question is, were these limitations placed on Louis by his father warranted or not? Was Louis at one time actually trusted by his father? Was he only handcuffed after showing his untrustworthiness or his inability to rule? Or was his father too obsessed with maintaining control in his ever-contentious kingdom to even think about giving autonomy to one of his children? The answer to these questions is probably a little bit of both. Louis's father could certainly trust very few people in his time, and history had already shown that princely sons were not always to be trusted by their king father. However, one must remember that both Louis and his brothers rebelled against their father, and it seems that this was probably just a poor decision that was made on behalf of a young restless prince. Nonetheless, no matter whether one considers Louis unfairly treated or not, it cannot be doubted that he did very little to advance the prestige of the Carolingian kings of the Franks, if only for the fact that he ruled for such a short time. It is not surprising that Louis has been largely forgotten in French history, and this is no doubt due to not only his short reign, but also due to his perceived weakness as a ruler. Despite this, it is important to remember that he was a king, that he did make decisions during his short reign, however few they may have been, and that the kingdom of West Francia would continue to be ruled by his bloodline for some time after his death. Thus, it is important that we take a moment to remember Louis and the contributions he made, however small, in the changing politics of Carolingian Francia.